So welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. I hope you're enjoying Google Developer Day so far. My name is Brian Kennish. I'm a developer advocate at Google. I work on a few different products. Today I'm going to be talking about Google Chrome, and specifically I'll be talking about Chrome's new extension system. So I'll start out with an introduction to what extensions are, and I'll show you some demos of existing extensions, so you get an idea of what they look like and the sorts of things they're capable of doing. After that, I'll talk a little bit about why we think extensions are interesting and worthwhile from a developer perspective to actually spend your time on. And then I'll give you some details about the timeline and roadmap for when we're releasing various pieces of the extension system. Next, I'll get to the main part of my talk, which is the technical stuff. I'll start out by discussing how you go about building extensions in general, and I'll give you a little tour of the extension API. Next, we'll walk through coding a specific example step by step. So we'll start out with a really basic hello world type of extension and add more and more features until we end up with a robust and non-trivial extension. Next, I'll do just a quick recap of some of the key points that I covered, and then I'll take your questions in the remaining time. If I touch on something that doesn't make any sense, feel free to shout out a question as well. So let's start out by talking about what extensions are. So, of course, you already know what browser extensions are. They're programs, usually small ones, that add bits of functionality to the browser and modify its behavior. And Chrome extensions are just that for the Google Chrome browser. Now, there are a bunch of unique things about Chrome extensions. One really important one is that they're written entirely with standard web technologies, so HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and so on. And that means that if you know how to create web pages, you already know most of what you need to know to create extensions. And in fact, Google Chrome extensions are web pages. This is something that I'll probably repeat a whole bunch of times because it's a really key point. Of course, there's a little bit more to creating a Chrome extension than there is to creating a web page. We have an API for the extension system that lets you integrate with specific pieces of the Google Chrome browser. The API is quite easy to learn. There's about 40 methods and about 20 objects that are defined in the API. And I said I was going to repeat this a bunch of times. So since extensions are web pages, the same development cycle that you use for building web pages, you can apply to extensions. And that means that when you make a change to your extension, there's no compilation step involved. Rather, you simply reload the extension and you can immediately see the results of your change. In addition, you can use the Google Chrome developer tools to inspect the DOM of the different pieces of your extension and to profile and debug the JavaScript inside of your extension. So from a user perspective, extensions install instantly. A user clicks on a link to install an extension and they click through an installation dialog. And the extension works immediately. There's no browser restart involved in the process. In addition, extensions can update automatically and seamlessly, just like the Google Chrome browser does. So when there's a new version of an extension available, the user doesn't have to do anything manual. Rather, the extension system periodically will check for new versions, and when it finds it, it just goes ahead and updates. From the developer side, when you have new changes available for your extension, you simply upload them, and they seamlessly get pushed out to your user base. Now, with any extension system, there are always significant concerns about both security and performance, and I want to touch on how we've approached this on the Google Chrome team. So on the security side, we make it so that extensions have to be really clear and specify what they're able to do, both in terms of the cross-origin XML HTTP requests that they're able to make, and in terms of the features that they're able to plug into in the browser, such as whether they're able to read and write to a user's bookmarks. So when a user installs an extension, we take these specifications, it's hosted in a little file, and we translate them into language that the average user can understand. In addition, power users can take a look at that file and see in more details specifically what the extension does. And in fact, a savvy user can look at all the source code for any extension and see exactly what the extension does. In terms of performance, extensions run in a separate OS process, just like Google Chrome tabs do. And that means that the performance of any given extension is isolated from the rest of the browser. So if you have a poorly performing extension, it's only going to be able to have a limited impact on the overall browser performance. And again, a savvy user can pop open the Google Chrome Task Manager and take a look at how all their installed extensions are performing. If they see one that's performing badly, they can choose to disable or uninstall it. So we could talk about extensions a whole bunch, but they're a whole lot more fun to play with, so let's take a look at a few. So the first extension that I'm going to show you is a simple Gmail checker. It's going to install a little icon in my Chrome toolbar, and if I'm logged into Gmail, which I believe I am now, it will put up a badge that displays a count of my unread messages. So I'm going to switch browsers here, and I'm doing that for a couple of reasons. One is that I don't want to lose my place in the slides, but I'm also running here a tip of tree build of Chrome. So this is the absolute latest version of Chrome, and it has a few more extension features that I want to show to you guys. So again, to install an extension, I just click on it, and I click through a confirmation dialog. So in this case, this dialog is telling me that the extension is going to have access to google.com, which is obviously what I want. Now before I click install here, I want you guys to pay attention to my browser toolbar right here, because this particular extension does a cool little spinny animation thing while it's polling for my number of unread messages. So I'm going to click install. And you see it did that little rotating animation thing that's painted with HTML5 canvas. And on top of it, it overlays a badge that says I have 340 unread messages. So I better start talking a little faster so I can get back to reading email. So that's a little bit tiny on my screen. So I'm going to show you a bigger version of that. This is what it looks like in blown up form. The next extension that I'll show you is a feed detector. So this extension will examine the contents of any page that I navigate to. And if it sees that there's an RSS or other feed available on the page, it'll insert a clickable button in my Omnibar. That's where you can search in Chrome. And if I click on that button, it'll build a page that lets me to subscribe to any of the feeds available on that page. So before I install this, I'm going to uninstall the other extension that I just installed to keep my UI as clean as I possibly can. This is the extension management page that you're seeing here. And again, I'm just going to go through that familiar installation process. In this case, this extension is saying that it has access to every page on the net, which is, again, what I want because it has to examine the contents of every single page. So I'm going to start out by doing a search for Google Developer Day. Hopefully I spelled that right. And you can see in my Omnibar, nothing has appeared here. And that's actually as intended because plain Google search doesn't make an RSS feed available. However, if I do that same search on Google News, which you guys can probably tell me better, but I think this is Google News, right? Yes. You can see now I get a little feed icon here. And that means that it's detected one or more feeds on this page that I'm on. Then I can, as I mentioned, I can click on this. And it's going to build a page that lets me subscribe to any of the feeds that are available on that page. So again, here's a blown up version of it because it's pretty small on my screen here. So the last extension that I'll show you is it's a very specific use case, but it comes quite in handy. So if you've ever tried to transfer a URL or some other long text from your main computer, whether it be your desktop or your laptop, to a mobile device, it can be quite a pain. You have to type in one character at a time. If you type one character wrong and say go, you get a 404. So what this extension does is it lets you take URLs and other arbitrary text and turn them into QR codes. And then you can just hold your phone up to it. Let's say I have an Android phone here, and hit one button and immediately go to the site. So again, I'm just going to uninstall this previously installed extension. And this dialog will be exactly the same as what we saw in the feed reader example, because this will be able to access every single page that I navigate to. And I'm going to reuse this Google News search that I did here. And you can see if I mouse over these URLs, there are some quite long URLs in here. So in order to turn this extension on, I press Control-Q on my keyboard. And now when I mouse over URLs, it'll insert a QR code. This actually comes from Google Charts. And I can also, as I mentioned, select some arbitrary text. Say I wanted to copy and paste something from my computer to my phone. And again, I just press Control-Q, and it'll turn that into a QR code. So I don't have my phone hooked up to a projector here, but I have a screenshot to show you. This is what it might look like on an Android device. This is an app called Barcode Scanner. So again, you just hold your phone up to your screen, and when the app identifies an extension, you could just press this one button, Open Browser, to see the page in your mobile app without having to do any typing at all. So you go from having to type a whole bunch of characters to just pressing one button. So why should you spend your time working on extensions? Well, first of all, Google Chrome is a really rapidly growing platform. The browser currently has more than 30 million active users, and it's actually more than tripled that number of active users in the last 2 quarters. So it's growing really, really fast. In addition, Chrome as a platform is really important to Google, both in terms of the browser and in terms of Chrome OS. So we have a big commitment at Google to making this a successful platform. And actually, if you write an extension today, you're also, without having to do any extra work, writing a Chrome OS app. When Chrome OS is available, it'll just work as a Chrome OS app. So you get to be part of this platform and have a nice first mover advantage if you start building extensions early on. In addition, extensions provide you a persistent presence on users' machines. So if you have a website and you have a loyal user that installs an extension for your site, even when they navigate away from your site, they can continue to interact with your service. And in a similar way, you can use extensions to drive traffic back to your site. So again, a user navigates away from your site, they can continue to interact with it, and you can have them go back to your site as well. And finally, and I think most importantly for us developers, extensions are really easy. I think your first extension, you can probably write a hello world type of extension in only 10 or 20 minutes. And the beauty of extensions is, once you get over those initial basics of how you actually go about writing an extension, then you're just applying the web skills that you already have. Since extensions are web pages, you just interface with the web just like you do on a web page. And as you get into building more and more complex extensions, you're really just leveraging those skills that you already have. So again, as web pages, you're really only limited in terms of what you can do by what you can come up with. Finally, before we get into the tech stuff, I just want to give you a few details about when the extension system will be fully available. So today, extensions are available in the Google Chrome dev channel. And I'll just take a step back and explain the different flavors that Chrome comes in. So there are 3 different builds of Chrome that go out. They go out in a stable channel, a beta channel, and a dev channel. So the stable channel is what the vast majority of users are using. And as the name implies, it's the most stable version of Chrome. The beta channel is where we put all the features that we expect to end up in the stable version, but they might not necessarily be in their final and most polished form. And we do a release to the beta channel about once every month or so. And then we have the dev channel, which contains all those features that we expect to end up in the stable channel, but it also has experimental features that we just throw out there and see if they stick. And we do a release to the dev channel about once every week. In fact, in the last year, I believe we've done 51 dev channel releases. So the extension system right now is on the dev channel. If you want to use and develop extensions, you go and subscribe to the dev channel. Later this quarter, we're going to be pushing the extension system to the beta channel. So we'll make it available to a significantly wider audience. And around the same time, we're going to be releasing an extension gallery. So this will make extensions much more findable. If you're building extensions, that's a great thing for you. And as soon as we can after that, we're going to be pushing extensions to the widest array of users into the stable channel. So any questions out there before I get to the tech stuff? All right. So let's talk about how to build extensions. First of all, I'm going to talk about the components that make up an extension. So an extension, a Google Chrome extension, is simply a compressed directory that has a number of web files in it. The one file that every single extension has to have is a manifest file. And I mentioned earlier in terms of security, where you specify your capabilities and such, this is where they go. So in addition to having to have this one file, this file also has to have a particular name, which is manifest.json. And as that name implies, this is JSON formatted data. And it contains metadata about the extension, things like the extension's name, a description of it. And it also contains, as I mentioned, the permissions and capabilities. And then finally, pointers to all the other different components of the extension. So let's talk about those next. So first of all, an extension can have one or more of these components. And these components are what actually make the extension do stuff. Without them, extension isn't really anything at all. So the first is a browser action or page action. These are the 2 UI surfaces that we're going to be shipping the extension system with initially. And we've seen both examples of both of these in the demos that I showed. So the Gmail checker used a browser action. That's an icon that appears in the Chrome toolbar on every single browser window and tab. And then we had a page action that we saw in the feed detector. So this is an icon that selectively appears in the Chrome omnibar. It can be toggled on and off depending on the state of the extension. So as you know, Chrome has a very minimal UI. So we're trying a little bit of an experiment where initially we're only letting an extension use one of these UI surfaces or the other. And that's why I have an or statement in there. So initially, an extension will be able to use a browser action or a page action. Later on down the road, we might open that up more. As I said, it's an experiment. We're going to see how it works. The next component that we can have is a content script, which is CSS or JavaScript that gets injected into any page that a user browses to. And again, we saw an example of this with the QR code generator where it was injecting both CSS and JavaScript into the contents of pages. So this is similar to user scripts on other browsers. So next we have a background page. So all these different components of an extension, when you start to get into more complex extensions, you really want to manage the different bits of your extension. And as I'll talk about more on the next slide, the different components have different scopes inside of the browser. And a background page is this global, long-running script that lets you manage tasks and state between the different components of an extension. Again, I'll touch on this a little more in the next slide. And then finally, we have any other web files that you want to put in your extension. So if you have images that you want to include, style sheets, Flash files, whatever. Since extensions are web pages, anything that you can render on the web, you can pretty much throw into an extension. So I mentioned a little bit that the different components of an extension can have different scopes. So we can have a background page, which there's one instance of a background page per extension. It's a global in scope. And then we have a browser action, which can have one instance per browser window. So you can have multiple browser actions inside of your extension at any given time. And then we have content scripts and page actions, which have one instance per tab. So you can have even more instances of those. And the way that you coordinate between all of these is by doing internal extension communication. So you can pass messages back and forth between the different components of your extension, and this is a part of our extension API. In addition, extensions, as I mentioned a little bit, can do external communication by making cross-origin XHR requests. And this requires a permission in the manifest file. When we start looking at code, I'm going to show you an example of this. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what the extension API looks like. So we have a top-level object called Chrome, which automatically gets exposed to every extension. And inside this object, we've subdivided the API into 6 different modules. They're encapsulated in objects that are contained in this top-level Chrome object. The first one is Chrome.extension, and this contains properties and methods primarily for doing the extension communication that I mentioned in the previous slide. So it lets you fetch references to the different components of an extension and listen for and send messages back and forth between them. The next object that we have is Chrome.browser_action. And obviously, this one is around manipulating your browser actions. So it lets you set the contents of a browser action, as well as the badge that can appear on top of the browser action. So in that Gmail checker example, we saw that it displayed a badge that had my number of unread messages. That was actually something that wasn't rendered by the extension itself. It's part of the extension system. So you can set the text of that as well as the background color, and you do that through this object. And then we have a page action, which simply lets you toggle the state of the page action on and off. The next set of objects that we have are all around integrating with the browser. So the first is Chrome.windows. This lets you create, delete, get, and set windows inside of Chrome. And as it says here, that requires a tabs permission in your manifest file. So this actually isn't a typo. We've since manipulating windows and tabs are very similar, they have a common permission that they share, and it's called tabs. The next object that we have is Chrome.tabs, and likewise, it lets you do the same thing with tabs and requires a tabs permission in your manifest file. And finally, we have Chrome.bookmarks, which lets you read and write to the user's bookmarks tree, and that one requires a bookmarks permission. So I want to touch on a few other APIs that are quite useful when you're building an extension. And again, you've heard me say this a bunch of times now. Extensions are web pages, so they can use any of the APIs that other web pages have access to. So first, we have standard JavaScript and DOM APIs, which let you traverse and manipulate the different pieces of your extension. Next, we have the HTML5 API. So all the HTML5 pieces that Google Chrome supports, you can use in your extensions. Some of the ones that are particularly useful are things like Canvas, which we saw in that Gmail checker example. You can use audio and video elements. You can use the geolocation API, which I guess isn't strictly part of HTML5, but is sometimes bundled in there, as well as local storage. Local storage is in particular really useful for maintaining a user state across browser sessions. Then we have the Webkit APIs. So Chrome extensions obviously only run in Google Chrome, so you don't have to worry about cross-browser compatibility. There's some really interesting experimental CSS features that are built into Webkit, things like animation, the sort of thing that you saw in that initial Gmail checker example, the spinny thing. That wasn't in particularly done with WebKit CSS, but it's the type of thing that you could do. Next, we have V8 APIs, and V8 in particular has JSON support that's built into it. When we look at some code later, you're going to see that I'm using our native JSON APIs to manipulate, to parse JSON. And this is obviously particularly useful if you're making XHR requests. Then bundle JavaScript libraries. So if you happen to be a fan of a JavaScript framework like jQuery or Protocol, you can just use include those in your extension directory and use them just as you would with just as you normally would. And finally, we have more stuff. So there are lots of Google APIs that you can call with JavaScript. There's 20 or so, I think. And you can just go ahead and use anything like that in your extension. All right, so with that, let's actually take a look at some code. So the extension that we're going to build is called Critter. It is a Chrome Twitter client. And I said that we're going to start out really simple. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a little browser icon, a browser action icon to our Chrome toolbar. So I'm going to pop over to my code editor here. And the first file that I'm going to show you is the manifest file. Again, this is the one file that every extension has to have. And you can see it specifies a name for our extension, a version, description, icons, which is what the user will see when they install the extension. And then here's the actual UI piece. This is where our browser action is specified. So we have a default icon. That's the icon that will appear in the Chrome toolbar. We have a title, which is the tooltip that'll show up when we mouse over our icon. And then this is something that we haven't seen before. It's a pop-up. So when the user clicks on a browser action, we can show a pop-up that contains more UI. Next, I'll show you my pop-up HTML file. You can see that it's a regular HTML file. It's about as simple as you can get. We just have a little bit of text that we specify in the file. So let's load this up and see what it looks like. Let's do some cleanup here. So you're going to see that this has a blank installation dialog because this extension doesn't actually do anything. So I'm going to install it. You can see that my icon appeared here. If I mouse over it, I get the tooltip that says Critter, as we specified. And then when I click on it, I get a pop-up that says, wouldn't it be nice to see some tweets here? And I think it would be nice, so let's go ahead and add them. So what we're going to start out by doing is adding, we'll add the public Twitter timeline. So we'll just get the public timeline and populate our pop-up window with that. So I'll start out by showing you the manifest file. And you're going to see that we added a section here of permissions. So first we have the tabs permission. The reason that we're requesting tabs access here is that we're going to insert links into each of our tweets. And when the user clicks on them, we want it to open a new tab rather than to just open a tab on top of our pop-up. And then we're specifying a permission to access twitter.com, which is where Twitter's API is. Next, we'll look at the changes that we made to our pop-up window. So you can see that we've added a whole bunch of JavaScript here. But first, I want to start off by showing you the HTML elements that we've added. So we're adding a title, Critter. And then we have an empty element called timeline, which is where we're going to insert all of our, dynamically insert all of our tweets into. And then finally, we have a template here, which is hidden with CSS. And we're going to use this to insert the different attributes of our tweets into here, and then clone it and add it progressively to our UI. So in our JavaScript, we're working with an onload handler here and calling in a init function, which gets references to all those template attributes. And then we're calling this getTweets function. So the getTweets function does a simple XHR request. Again, it's making that to get the public Twitter timeline, and it's asking for it in JSON format here. And then we specify an onload handler when that request is finished. And this is our handler here. So you can see here that we're using the built-in support for JSON that's in V8. We don't have to specify any particular JSON library. And we have a global object where we store all of our tweets. And then we call this update function to actually refresh the UI. So this update function will loop through all of the tweets that we've retrieved, and then progressively add the different attributes into our template. So we're going to add a thumbnail, which will have a link, and we're going to add the author's name and, of course, the tweet content. Then, as I mentioned, we're going to clone each of these filled out templates and add them to our timeline. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like now. Now this is going to ask me for a little more permission because now this extension can access twitter.com. So I'm going to grant it that permission. Now when I click on this pop-up, I should actually see a timeline filled with tweets. And there we go. We have the public Twitter timeline. And again, we've made all these things clickable, and they should open in a new tab. And there we go. All right, so next, when we start to get into more and more complex extensions, we're going to want to start leveraging that background page to coordinate between the different components. So in this particular extension, starting to use a background page is going to give us a couple of advantages. One, it's going to make it easier to add things later on down the road, but it'll also let us improve the UI, because the way this extension works now is all the action, the XHR request, is only triggered when the pop-up onload handler is triggered. So that means it can only actually do stuff when the user clicks on the browser action icon. But instead, if we use a background page, we can start making requests immediately when the extension is installed or when the user opens the browser. And in particular, that will let us collect a whole bunch of tweets rather than the 20 at a time that we just asked for. And it'll let us add a badge to the browser action that specifies how many unread tweets are available. So again, we'll start with our manifest file here. And all we've added is a pointer to a background page. We're going to do some refactoring in our pop-up HTML. Basically, we're just going to make it smaller. So we're turning our pop-up into a dumb view, essentially, now. All it's going to know how to do is to refresh its UI. It's not going to do any more requesting. That will be delegated to the background page. So we haven't changed our HTML at all, but we've added a pointer to the background page. So now in the extension's init function, it will request the location of the background page. And the update function remains essentially the same, except we're now prefixing all the pointers to the tweets with the background object, because now, again, the tweets are going to be stored in the background page. So now I'll load up our background page. And here's where we've moved the request functionality to. So we've added a variable for fetch frequency, because now, again, we're not limited to just when the user clicks on that pop-up, but immediately we can just start aggregating tweets in here. And I set this to a very high number, 30 seconds. You probably wouldn't want that in production, but I've done that so that when I show you the UI, you can actually see the counter updating. We've also added an unread count, which is where we're going to keep track of the number of unread tweets and post them into the browser action badge. And again, we just kicked off this get tweets function immediately and repeatedly do it at the fetch frequency that we specified. The particular function has remained exactly the same, the get tweets function. And now we've made a little change to our code in the process tweets function. So after we get the results back from Twitter, we update the unread count. And then if we have more than 0 unread items, we're making some API calls to set the background color of the badge and actually fill out its text with the unread count. So let's fire that up and see what it looks like. Again, this installation dialog will be exactly the same. And you can see now I have a badge with 20 tweets in there. I'll just let it think for a little while and update to 40 before I actually click on it. Maybe I should have made this a little shorter than 30 seconds. Yay, there it goes. So now if I click on it, we'll see basically the exact same UI, except now I have 40 tweets inside of my pop-up instead of 20. You'll notice that this particular extension is missing pagination. That's probably something that you'd want to add if you turn this into a production extension. All right, so getting the public timeline is kind of nice as a toy, but in practice, you're generally not going to want Twitter's public timeline if you happen to be a Twitter user. You want your friend timeline. So that's what we're going to add next. So again, we'll start out by making a little change to our manifest file. In this case, what we've added is a content script. So in order to get your friend's timeline, we have to do some OAuth. And I'm going to do a little bit of a hand wave on the OAuth stuff because I want to focus on some things that are unique to extensions. And we're going to have a content script that, so we're using Twitter's pin mechanism for desktop clients. So when the user grants access to our app, they're going to get a pin. And normally what would have to happen is the user would copy and paste the pin into the app. But we're going to make it a little bit easier. We're going to automatically copy the pin for them and send it into our extension. And we're going to use a content script to do this. So the content script is going to examine the contents of this authorization page, find the pin, and send it into our extension. And we're calling the script content.js. So we've made a bit of a change to our pop-up file. We've added the notion of being signed in or signed out. Again, since OAuth has to happen here, the user will initially start in a signed out state. And we've added some tiny little UI for that. We have a sign-in image that we're going to display by default. And then we've buried all of our regular UI into a signed-in div, which will hide by default. So we've also added in our init function the notion of whether the user is signed in or not, and this is stored in a variable in the background page. And again, everything is very familiar here. In the update function, we've just added the fact that when the update happens, we want to toggle from the signed out state to the signed in state and actually display the list of friend tweets. So next, we're going to look at our background page. And we have the OAuth in this utility file. All the OAuth code I put in there so we can focus on the extension code. The first thing that I've added here is a listener. So we are going to listen for incoming messages from the content script. When it detects a successful login, it'll send a pin over to us, which we'll get in this data object. It's also going to send a state of success as true or false, whether or not it was able to successfully extract that pin. And then if it is successful, then it will request a access token from Twitter. And we're not making a regular XHR request anymore. We're making a signed OAuth request now. So we're sending this to a function that knows how to do that. We've also, instead of immediately starting to request tweets, because that won't work anymore because the user initially won't be logged in, we have this put into a callback function called start fetching. So this function will be called when we successfully have an access token. And finally, our gets tweets function, we've added a parameter to keep track of what unread count we're up to, so what ID we've already fetched. And then again, we make a signed OAuth request instead of our previous plain XHR request. And then our process tweets function is exactly the same. So the last thing that we'll look at is the content script. And you'll see that this is very simple. In the OAuth pin page, it's going to go out and grab that pin. And then it's just going to do some cleanup on the pin if it successfully got it, and send a message that says success equals true and with the pin information. If it wasn't able to successfully grab the pin, then it'll say success false. And our listener function will be the one that is getting the results of this message. So let's take a look at what that looks like in a browser. So you can see now I have this little question mark that indicates that I'm not successfully authorized. So I'm going to click on that, and I get this new image that I added that asks me if I want to sign in with Twitter. So I'll click on that. This will take me to an OAuth page where I'll allow. And then here's where it'll send me back a pin. Normally, again, I would have to copy and paste this into the app, but I have a content script that does that automatically, sends it back into the app, and then closes that window. And you can see now I have 20 tweets, and if I click on that, I'll see my own personal timeline rather than the public timeline. And there we go. Lots of poker stuff. Okay. So finally, I want to show you the auto-update functionality of Twitter. Eventually, when we have a gallery, it will actually be even easier than what I'm going to show you, but it's already pretty easy now, so I want to go ahead and show you how you go about doing this. So we're going to add a tiny little bit of code to our manifest file. And we've just added this key value that has an update URL. And it's pointing to a location that I happen to be serving off of my local host on this machine. Then I'll show you, this isn't actually part of the extension, but I'll show you what that update file looks like. We're using the manifest specification of Omaha, which is Google's updating mechanism. So all we really have in this file is the app ID of the extension. And this is the app ID that gets signed into the extension when you package an extension. And I'm specifying a new version. So the extension that I'm going to have running is going to be version 5.0. I'm saying I now have a version 6.0, and here's where it is. So again, I'll install this. And this extension isn't going to do a whole lot in the way of UI, because the only thing I've really updated here is the version. So normally, the extension system would check about every few hours to see if there's new versions of any extensions. We don't want to wait, of course, for a few hours to see if this worked or not. So we're just going to manually hit this Update Extensions Now button. And what should happen if everything works right is this version 5.0 will switch to a 6.0. So I'm going to hit Update. And I just want to show you how quickly Chrome can restart here. So let's see what happened with my extension. Oh, it upgraded to 6.0. Let me see if I can do that without crashing the browser. Oops. Okay, so I have my version 5.0. Let's try that again. And yay, now we have version 6.0. So that's some of what you can do with the extension system. I just want to quickly summarize 3 key points of what I just covered. So number 1, as I mentioned, extensions are super duper easy. You can get your first Hello World up and running in 10 or 20 minutes. Google Chrome has over 30 million active users, and 2/3 of those have started using Chrome in just the last 2 quarters. So it's something that's growing really rapidly. It's a great opportunity to get involved early. And finally, we have a whole lot of upcoming events, I think especially around the GTUGs, where, so if you're not familiar, GTUGs is Google Technology User Groups, and they focus on Google technology. They meet generally once a month or so and focus on a specific Google technology. So there should be some upcoming events around Chrome extensions locally. If you guys are interested, there's a little lounge area out here that you can find out more information about the GTUGs. You can also go to gtugs.org. And this is both for if you're interested in attending these events or running one of the GTUG organizations. So with that, I think we should have about 10 minutes or so for questions, if you have any. While I take questions, I'll put up a page of helpful resources. We have our documentation, our blog, and our discussion group where you can find out more information. Any questions? Yes? That is a great question. So I'm not sure that we really have plans for that yet, but it seems like something, let me repeat the question. So the question is, will we be providing some Google Web Toolkit functionality to build extensions? I'm not sure it's something that we have planned yet, but it seems like something that we should talk to the GWT team about. Any other questions? Yes. Yep. So the question is, are there tools for debugging extensions? So the Google Chrome developer tools you can use for debugging extensions. I mentioned you can inspect the DOM of your extensions, and you can also use the JavaScript profiler and debugger. So the integration isn't super ideal yet, but it works pretty well already. And since they're web pages, you can use, if you're familiar with those tools, you can use them just as you would with web pages. Oh, in the context menu. So there is not currently an API for exposing the context menu. Again, we're shipping the extension system with 2 UI surfaces, but it's not the final set of UI surfaces by any means. We're going to continue to add more to the API. So we wanted in this initial release of the extension system to have a narrow set of APIs because we don't want to ever be in the situation where we break old extensions. So we want to be very careful with what we pick to release. So these are the ones that we're releasing initially, but we're continuing to iterate and add more APIs. Yeah, so context menus, I think, is something that would make sense to have in the extension system eventually. Yes? Can you change the home page with extensions? So you can change, there's an API for when you open a new tab for setting the page that opens into that new tab. Any other questions? Yes? Oh, sorry, say that again? So how easy is it to purport Firefox extensions to Chrome? So it depends a little bit on the particular Firefox extension. In some cases, it can be very easy, especially like user scripts. Grease Monkey scripts are quite easy to port over to the Chrome extension system. Yep. So I think actually, I believe the Adblock guys are working on porting their extension from Firefox to Chrome. But it's something that you can certainly do with the Chrome extension system. It would work as a content script where you're examining the contents of each page that the user navigates to and then stripping out the ads. Again, it definitely depends a lot. The question is, would it be easier to port a Firefox extension or start from scratch? It depends a lot on the extension. So, you know, if you're using things that are very particular to Firefox, then obviously it's going to be harder. If you're using things like NP API, which is a binary spec, a cross-browser binary spec, then it would be quite easy to port an extension like that. Sure. So the question is, will extensions work in Chrome Frame? Yep. So right now, the extension system doesn't ship with Chrome Frame. Perhaps it's something that we'll do down the line. Yes? What can you do with extensions? What can't you do with extensions? So I think the limitations right now are in terms of the UI surfaces that I mentioned. So you can only have an extension right now that inserts itself into the Chrome toolbar or into the Omnibar, or with a content script that injects itself into the contents of any page. So those are the limitations. You can't have a persistent bar, for example, that, you know, like a toolbar that would show up as an extension. Again, that's something that we might decide to add down the line, but we're being very careful about what we expose initially. So again, we don't break extensions down the road. Did that answer the question? Okay. Okay, I think I have time for maybe one more question. If there is one more question. Yes? So the question is, can you interact with the user file system with extensions? So I mentioned NP API binaries before. This is a binary that would be packaged with your extension. We generally discourage the use of them because it opens up a can of worms in terms of security, because you're asking users to install a binary. But you could do that with an NP API binary. As we get further into Chrome OS, you can expect that we'll have some APIs for interacting with the file system. And, you know, Chrome OS and Google Chrome browser are very closely related, so they should eventually be at parity in terms of APIs. Will it be read-write permissions into the file system? Again, I'd be speculating a little, but I would think so. I mean, with Chrome OS, you really need that ability if you're writing OS apps. All right, well, thank you, everyone. If you have more questions, I'll be around. And I'm going to be at office hours now, so feel free to come by. Thank you.